Good afternoon, and welcome to this ABC15 virtual town hall meeting, talking about the important issue of the day and what has been an important issue in our country for decades. Some would say it's been an important issue long before we became a country, for some 400 years. The issue of race relations and what we are seeing playing out on the streets of Phoenix and in cities all over the country. Protesters taking to the streets over the death of George Floyd. But George Floyd is just one name of many names that has caused outrage in this country and left people with heartache and sadness and anger and unbelievable calls for change. Joining us today, Courtney Holmes. She is one of our investigative reporters here at ABC 15. Kevin Robinson, former assistant police chief at the Phoenix Police Department. You were a police officer for 30 years, now teaching at ASU. Former County Attorney Rick Romley, who served 16 years in the County Attorney's Office as the lead prosecutor in one of the largest county attorney offices in the country. Rashad Shabazz, who is a professor in the School of Social, I'm going to screw this up, I know I'm going to, Social Transformation. There we go, the School of Social Transformation at ASU, and somebody who has made it his life work to understand the history of race relations and the topic of institutionalized or systemic racism as well. And of course, my name is Steve Irvin, and I anchor the news here on ABC 15. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and all of you who are joining us as well online. Feel free to weigh in with comments, questions, things that you'd like us to talk about, but certainly there is a lot to talk about. And I want to start, I guess, with what we are hearing from protesters themselves. Oh, that's very loud. What we're hearing from protesters themselves, that there's a message they want, particularly white people, to understand and to listen to. This idea that people don't understand terms like systemic racism, or they don't understand terms like white privilege, or they reject those kinds of terms in particular. And I wanted to start with Professor Shabazz on these terms, because I think it's important, if we're going to talk about this, to sort of go through the glossary here and to really define what we're talking about. So, Professor, if we talk about systemic racism, for instance, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a wonderful place to start. So systemic or institutional racism is about the way that race is woven into how institutions function. This has been documented countless times in the American housing system, where Black Americans were denied access to loans and denied access to move into white neighborhoods. It also functions, as we're seeing right now, in our healthcare systems, where Black Americans have higher rates of death in the face of COVID-19 because of comorbidities like hypertension or diabetes, that really manifest from having a lack of access to healthcare and a lack of access to healthy foods as well. And we also see it in the criminal justice system, where we have more than 2 million people incarcerated, half of them Black, a large number of them Latinx, the majority of them poor, and where Black and Latinx communities face punitive response from police for infractions that white Americans are either dismissed, or that they face the sort of normative punishment from the system. So when we talk about institutional racism, we're talking about how institutions, not individuals, but institutions, respond to communities based on color, ethnicity, and or in some cases, gender.
You've talked about a little bit the difference between feelings, the individual feelings that people have, and studying these systems which, for one reason or another, leave people of color in a different spot in this country and give them a different path. And people often get defensive when they talk about terms like systemic racism or white privilege, because they say, well, I'm not racist. I have black friends. I associate with people of color. I work with people of color. I don't discriminate. I try to treat everybody equally. People get very defensive when you start talking about these things, but there are differences between one's own personal feelings and what we're actually seeing in the system itself.
Right. So, personal feelings are not what constitute systemic racism. There may be biases that people have, but feelings are not at the core of racism. I often tell my students, nobody cares what you feel about a particular community. What we do care about is how communities are responded to through institutions, right? So how does the police respond to communities of color? How does banking and finance? How does the healthcare system? How does education respond to communities of color? And white privilege folds into that to the degree that white Americans are absolved from having to deal with the realities of race, right? Race in the way that it functions in this country lands heavily on Black, Latinx, Asian American communities, and as well as indigenous communities. Right? Those communities are forced to grapple with the everyday realities of race. They have to do the labor of dealing with it. White communities don't have to grapple with the realities of race, right? They don't even have to really talk about race. But for communities of color, it is a ubiquitous everyday thing, right? And this is one of the things that manifests itself in white privilege, right? The privilege of white people not having to grapple with the reality of race, not having to especially grapple with it in a negative way. And there's some correlation between this and the way that gender functions. Women deal with certain levels of gender discrimination that men do not deal with, right? And women have to grapple with the everyday politics of gender in ways that men do not. Race functions in very similar ways, where people of color are dealing with the realities of race in a day in and day out basis, and white Americans are not.
I want to ask particularly the people of color in this conversation about their own personal experiences. Have you ever felt, or have you felt on multiple occasions, or is it something that you deal with every day, that people look at you differently, treat you differently, and deal with you in a different way because of the color of your skin and the presumptions that people make about you? I know from reading your own bio, Professor Shabazz, that you have some experience in this growing up in the city of Chicago and the dealings that you had with police officers in the city of Chicago. But I want to get Courtney and Kevin to join in. Have you had those experiences, and can you share them with us?
Well, you want me? I'll go ahead first.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Okay. For me, the experiences, yes, they do occur. I would be lying or less than, I just wouldn't be forthright if I said I have not faced some forms of discrimination. And it is based on what I look like. I have had the experience of being in a department store here in the Valley and be followed. And that wasn't all that long ago. And there comes a time when you obviously become very frustrated by such things. And it all depends on how you respond to it. In the case, I was followed around. It was in a Dillard's store at Scottsdale Fashion Mall. And the person following me, I stopped, and I knew he was an undercover or a plainclothes police officer working off duty at the store. And I just asked him, "What are you with?" And he looked at me. He told me the Scottsdale Police Department. I said, "Tell Alan I said hello." And Alan was their police chief.
Mm-hmm.
And I just tell him Kevin said hello. And I turned around and walked away. And that was my way of being very deliberate with that individual, because I don't know that there was anything outside of what I looked like that there was any cause to follow me around. And that was a way I felt I could be deliberate, make sure he understood that I knew what he was doing, and for no other reason than what I looked like.
Courtney, do you have a story?
Well, I want to respond. Sort of, it has less to do with a personal story of being called a name or something like that, which of course has happened, and more to do with, like Dr. Shabazz was talking about, systems and having family members who, particularly men, who are who are, like Kevin was saying, followed in stores and things like that, and not having the opportunity, or like Kevin had, being able to go to someone and say, hey, I know Chief such and such. Everyone doesn't have that, right?
Mhm.
Everyone, more often than not, you just kind of got to take it. And I think that's why these protests are how they are right now, is that people are kind of tired of taking it. If Dr. Shabazz wanted to get in on that point of having to take it.
Well, I want to ask. I want to ask you and just interject a little bit, because the way white privilege is, at least my understanding of it is, white people just don't ever have to deal with things like that. You don't get followed around in the store. You don't get stopped by a police officer. You don't get detained by a police officer or held in a traffic stop longer than was really necessary. All of the different types of things that we hear, and that builds over a period of time. It builds frustration. It builds anger. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what a lot of people are saying about these protests, is this is just sort of the culmination of that. This has come to a head, and people are fed up with it. And to a certain extent, there are white folks out there who've never had to deal with it, who just don't understand that anger. Fair enough?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. The accumulation of the daily realities of racism and white supremacy, and how they land on people of color. They accumulate over a lifetime. And what they do is they create stress. They create fatigue. They create anxiety, and they create fear. You know, one of the things that many Black Americans fear is to look in their rearview mirror while they're driving and there's a cop there. You know, and it manifests itself physically, you know, elevated heart rate, sweaty palms. You know, these are responses to personal experiences that have manifested in trauma, and community-wide experiences that evoke this trauma. And so this is you know, what one writer called the fact of Blackness. You know, this is something that, you know, Black Americans grapple with on a daily in a daily way. And, you know, for white Americans, narrating the stories that, you know, we all have just narrated, unfortunately hasn't been enough, because, you know, white Americans have just said, you know, oh, well, that doesn't happen to me, so you must be lying, or you must be misinterpreting, or you know, you must have done something. And that the accumulation of that dismissiveness has really fueled people moving out onto the streets and demanding to be heard and understood. And you know, I really understand what many of the protesters are referring to. Right? It's an experience that I and millions of others have had. But the dismissiveness of our experiences, and the categorical belief that if white people don't experience it this way, then it doesn't happen, which is basically what, you know, white supremacy is about. This belief that, you know, white people's experience with anything universalizes it, and that's the experience. And if people of color have a different one, there must be some mistake. You know, you must be, you know, overblowing it. Right? Men do this with women in terms of gender, right? But that sort of categorical dismissiveness of our lived experiences has boiled over into the streets. And now, you know, we want accountability, we want justice, and we want our experiences to be registered, understood, and we want these problems to be rectified, because we can no longer go on living with these kinds of experiences that are really ingrained into community after community for generation after generation.
I wanted to get Rick Romley to weigh in, because you have a great deal of experience in the criminal justice system itself. Is there a sense in the justice system itself of many of the issues that we talk about in conjunction with these protests, mass incarceration, the idea that we need to enact criminal justice reform, that police need to build better relationships with minority communities? Is there an ongoing discussion of that in the criminal justice system itself? Are people talking about it, and what sort of things are they talking about in terms of trying to fix it?
Clearly, they're discussing it, but from my perspective, it's not enough. I think that in the recent events of, just recently with the body cam situation, it has brought to the forefront, the real seriousness of not addressing this in an adequate way. This has been a ongoing issue from my perspective for decades. We have seen these issues for a long period of time, and we have seen, I think, an erosion of the public trust in law enforcement, partially because of the body cams now, and they're seeing exactly what is occurring. And I think that there has to be probably an escalation, a greater emphasis upon how we're going to address this. We can no longer, quite frankly, tinker around the edges. We've talked about it. We've done some minor things, but to really address this issue, does anybody really question that this is a serious problem and that it has been going on for some period of time? I don't think so today. But the thing is what kind of leadership are we going to have going forward? And I think that there's got to be, strong reform in the justice system about how law enforcement addresses some of these issues. And my perspective is that, I believe in law enforcement. I think that 99% of the officers are good individuals that care deeply about their community, and they want to do the right thing. And we do have, unfortunately, some situations that do get out of control. And I fault it for a lot of reasons. Let me give you an example. And Kevin, you possibly could, weigh in here as well. Law enforcement made some dramatic changes in its training modules. After Columbine, after 9/11, it became much more aggressive. It was almost like it was an active shooter situation at all times. And it's just recently that we've begun to start talking about de-escalation tactics and to put a greater emphasis upon that. And, that's a training program that needs to be, put into all of the academies. It needs to be emphasized more by all of the departments. And how best do we go about that? And, I think that, those types of major reforms, training issues, perhaps, and Kevin will not, let me say this. I'm going to recommend some things that possibly law enforcement won't even like, because I've always been kind of one to push the envelope a little bit. I've been an advocate for some time that police agencies themselves should not investigate themselves. If there is a death that has occurred or serious physical injury that has occurred on a situation, that, the agency that it occurred within should not be investigating whether or not there was wrongdoing in that. And I think that we need to figure out a process by which we can call in others that can do the investigation and keep outside that agency. We've got to rebuild the public trust. And that's going to take a long time. We can lose it in a heartbeat, but it's going to take years and years. And I think that we've got to start doing a lot of different things to rebuild that public trust. And a lot of it is that we've got to show that there's accountability, that there is true objectivity, and that everybody is going to be looked at equally under the laws.
Let me ask you about the culture, though, of law enforcement, because you have some experience. In 2018, you were called in to investigate an incident involving Mesa officers beating a black man. The FBI had investigated it and found no wrongdoing. The Scottsdale Police Department had investigated it and found no wrongdoing. You investigated it and recommended disciplinary action, I believe, against 4 of the officers. And, there's a culture, I think, in law enforcement that perhaps we need to acknowledge, that we circle the wagons and we protect our own. And there's that thin blue line that we do not cross. And we often see officers rushing to the defense of other officers when they're accused of something like that, while telling the rest of us not to rush to judgment. Do we need to change the culture over the system in law enforcement?
I think absolutely. Look, well, as I've indicated, the great percentage of law enforcement officers are good individuals, but they cannot sit idly by and, let wrongdoing go unanswered or unchallenged in some particular way. I'll give you a particular example. When I stepped back in my role as county attorney, there was a murder that had taken place. And Kevin, you were there at the time. Officer Krisman, he was involved in a situation in which he was called to a disturbance situation, and two officers responded. And unfortunately, it resulted in the individual that the mother had called regarding her son. And Officer Krisman had shot and killed the individual, saying that basically the situation had gotten out of hand. He said that it was defensive in nature, but yet the other officer stood up. He stood up and says, no, deadly force was not necessary in this particular situation. And quite frankly, there was other evidence to show it as well. Unfortunately, rather than supporting the officer that was standing up and saying deadly force was not necessary, he was ostracized inside of the police department. I mean, he literally resigned as a police officer, a good police officer, because he stood up and did what was right. That's what I think you're trying to get to here, Steve, is there something inside of the department that needs to change? And yes, it does. They need to stand up. They're good individuals, and they cannot allow potentially improper conduct to go, the person not be held accountable in some way.
Kevin, you want to jump in? How do we change the culture within police departments itself?
I think the first thing, police departments and police departments are starting to get it, because what you saw with the incident in Minneapolis for the first time ever, I think, the rest of you will attest to this because it was happening right before it. You had police chiefs and other police departments around the country speaking out about how wrong the incident in Minneapolis was. Folks didn't sit on their hands. They didn't sit there and say, well, we're going to wait till the investigation comes back before we say anything. They saw wrong. They knew it was horrible, and they spoke out and they said so. That's a great step in the right direction. And the things that Rick is referring to, there is, unfortunately, that culture within some law enforcement agencies where you don't turn on another police officer. That's not behavior that we would, as police officers, expect from somebody out on the street, somebody involved in an investigation. So why in the world would we expect it internally? That message has to get out. People have to remember, police officers have to remember why they became police officers to begin with. So the vast majority of folks, like Rick said, well over 99% are out there to do the job. They're out there to help folks. They want to do the right thing. They cannot forget the right thing may even mean me turning on another officer and saying, hey, we don't do that. You don't treat people that way, and stop it, and then turn to your supervisor and tell your boss what's going on. That's how that stops, is when you demonstrate that we're not going to stand for it.
Well, a lot of reforms are blocked, quite frankly, by police unions. A lot of bad officers are kept on forces because of police unions. The culture is ingrained, whatever that culture is ingrained and upheld by police unions. How do you overcome that? How does an agency overcome that? That is not something that's going to happen overnight. And up until now, it's something that police agencies have just been trusted to do. So how does that change quickly?
Oh,
No, let me real quick. And this is, I think, the easiest way for something like that is for police chiefs to be given the authority, the autonomy to do the things that they think is right. And if that means firing somebody, that means firing them. So that tells us that, quite honestly, the political aspect of being a police chief has to change. We talk about cultures within police departments, but sometimes that police chief, and we have a saying in law enforcement, everybody has a sergeant, meaning everybody has a supervisor. That police chief usually reports to a city manager or deputy city manager or someone along those lines, or even in some cases the mayor. As long as those folks are beholden to politicians and there's that political bent to things, I think you're going to have that issue. because you're going to bend with, if the union is strong and they're able to push a lot of votes or cash or money or whatever it happens to be toward a certain politician, of course they're going to have the support of that politician. So you have to worry about those types of things.
But how does that get undone? Because that's one of the systems, and maybe Mr. Rommel, you can get in on this, but that's one of the systems that is in place that protesting can't fix, that legislation can't fix. How does that get fixed? Because police unions are the number one reason why reforms don't happen in departments.
And Courtney, this is Rick again. I couldn't agree with you more. I've talked with the different union representatives on a number of occasions, and going back to the Chrisman matter that I spoke about earlier, I sat down with the union leaders and I sat there and I said, look, let the criminal justice system work through this as we're prosecuting this officer. Don't stand behind this person. Don't defend this individual before all the facts come out in court. I got such pushback from the unions. It was unbelievable. I mean, it was vitriolic. I mean, it was literally nasty. There has to be some type of changes, and it's probably going to require legislation, state laws, because unfortunately, everybody has that little bit of political bent. The city managers, they don't want to upset the unions because it keeps us calmer. As mayors and city council members, they want to keep it calm so that it doesn't hurt their potential reelection matters. So we're going to have to look at legislation, quite frankly, and put it in state law. And the union has a strong presence out at the legislature, but it's time for us to stand up. And, this is when real leadership begins to show itself. And right now is the time we got to do it. But I think it's going to require legislative fixes. And I agree more with Kevin that chiefs have been so hamstrung. It's so difficult to let an officer go or even to discipline individuals. I mean, to give you an example, when I did the, Steve, as you mentioned, when I did the Mesa Police Department, one of the things I found out when I was overseeing the internal affairs investigation on the abuse of force, the union had worked in their contract and worked with politically with people inside of the city that they were able to purge disciplinary files out of the records. Well, how in the world can you determine what should be progressive discipline if you don't know what they did, the half dozen other times? It's purged out of the records. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So it's going to take, I think, legislative acts to really make a difference.
And to follow up on what you just said about it taking legislative act, we know how slow legislation is. There are people protesting today, right now, probably tomorrow, have been for a week. I would venture to guess that protesters don't want to hear that some legislation might come down the pike and may or may not get a hearing next session. What happens between now and then?
Now and then, unfortunately, police chiefs are hamstrung. I mean, they can make certain types of policy changes within their own department, but it's really not that major reform that's needed. But hey, we've got an election coming up. Ask your county attorney now, as you used to ask me every single day. What are you going to do? Why aren't they out there talking to the public, getting the public to understand that it's going to take this? We need to keep the conversation going. We need to create a movement. We have an election coming up this year. And so we've got to let them know that there's consequences if you don't make a major change. Welcome to politics. I wish I could give you the instantaneous answer. It's not going to be. We can do some things on the short term, but I think that the real major reforms are going to require more time. And as the professor has said, this has been not just decades, it's been centuries that there have been problems in this particular area. What we've got to do is keep the conversation going. We've got to keep people understanding that this is serious and we've got to deal with it. And it's not just the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, the criminal justice system is the backdrop for everything that's wrong in our society. When we have a horrible mental health system, what happens? Cops are now having to deal with the mental health system. You have inequalities in opportunities, and so what happens? You have more poor individuals that don't have the opportunities, and so it always comes into the criminal justice system. It's a lack of leadership, not just on criminal justice, but on a variety of different programs, facing this nation and our community. And you know what? If you haven't got the right leaders, then get rid of them and get some new ones.
Professor Shabazz, you have studied the history of race relations in this country and how different conditions going back to the Reconstruction after the Civil War have led to the conditions we see now in minority communities all across the country. What does history tell us about the speed of social change? Is this something that we can necessarily fix, or is it even something that we can achieve in our lifetimes?
The march toward justice is oftentimes long, slow, and arduous. And to paraphrase what has been said, protesters are not trying to hear that. And the truth of the matter is that the nation and Black communities and communities of color and communities who feel under assault by the criminal justice system should not have to wait. These communities have been waiting for decades upon decades upon decades, really since, the turn of the 20th century. We have been seeing the use of policing and the criminal justice system as a way to contain and punish and really to organize public interactions in cities all across the United States: Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and many others. So, to hear that, we'll have to wait until sort of, the legislative session or until the governor or until senators or our president come to some kind of consciousness or wait until the sort of, large majority of the white citizenry feel compelled is really difficult to swallow. And that is what is in part fueling the anger and the frustration and sending people to the streets. We cannot wait another legislative cycle. We cannot wait another year. We cannot wait another generation until people become open and thoughtful and reflective and conscious and willing to participate in transformation. We need it now. And this is part of, something that everyone on the panel has been saying: leadership. We have deeply, deeply troubling leadership at the state and federal level. They lack empathy. They lack good ideas. They lack an understanding of the problem. And their only solution is the iron fist. Their only solution is more pressure, more violence, more force. And that simply creates more problems. So, we're dealing with multiple problems simultaneously. We're dealing with a fundamental lack of leadership at the state and at the state and federal level. And then we're dealing with a legislative process that takes years in order to make substantive change to ensure that people are safe in their communities. And I think this is part of the reason why we've been seeing protesters here yesterday in downtown Phoenix and in other parts of the country calling for cutting the police budget, because this is a direct and immediate way to stave off the violence of policing and the criminal justice system that's been affecting communities of color without having to go through a long legislative process. And these are important ideas that we need to consider nationally. And it's more than just cutting the budget, all right? It's really about transferring the wealth that has been moved, the public wealth that has been underwriting police budgets in cities and towns all over the nation into other areas like education, social services, parks and recreation, which overwhelmingly have more impact on the longevity, stability, and health of people's lives than policing does. Policing is an after the fact act. It's all retroactive. Something happens, the police get called, but parks and recreation, education, healthcare, those things sustain people's lives on a daily basis. They create a much more fundamental and healthy way of organizing people's lives and of people being able to live. And policing and the criminal justice system really devours social and economic wealth, right? It takes from the taxpayers, it takes from schools, it takes from hospitals and public education, right? It takes from health and human services. And for what? For what? For more policing? For more people in cages? So we need a fundamental rethinking of what criminal justice, of what the criminal justice system is going to do. And we need to fundamentally rethink how we spend our money, how we use our financial and social wealth to better the lives of people in this country. And so I support what Black Lives Matter and other organizations have been calling for, which is to remove some of the funding from police departments and put it into social service agencies. I just give you one example of what I mean by the significant amount of money. In the early 2000s, the Chicago Police Department had more of the city's budget than the school system. I'll say that one more time. In the early 2000s, the Chicago Police Department took up more of the city's budget than the public school system. That really demonstrates where our priorities are, that we have invested more money in policing and locking people up than we have in providing them with a decent education. And with that kind of imbalance, right, it not only throws our social system out of whack, but it says that punishment is more important than education, that we'll have a cell for you, whether as opposed to a desk full of books, that we will have officers who are being paid well and teachers who are not. And we cannot sustain that system for not just another generation, not just another cycle. We can't sustain it for another day, and it must be changed.
Kevin, I want to give you a chance to talk about police budgets and this idea that police generally come in after the fact and clean up the mess that is created when we don't provide quality education, quality economic opportunity for low-income communities. This is a serious proposal, cutting 25% of the Phoenix police budget and putting that into other things. What would that do to the Phoenix Police Department?
Well, Dr. Shabazz is right. The bottom line is police departments, for all practical purposes, are reactive. Things have already occurred, then they come out and try to take care of the problem. If we can put more of our resources into being proactive, where crimes don't occur, the better off we are. The departments used to have more programs geared toward youth, geared toward kids. And when you had those programs, you didn't have the crime involving youth in those areas. So obviously an investment at the front end pays off in the long run. What it would do to the police department budget now, I don't know. I can tell you that the public safety budget for the city of Phoenix is probably about 60% of the overall city budget. It is significant. It's the vast majority of the city budget. So more goes to police and fire than anything else. But they are the organizations or the departments that are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining, it does take a whole lot. Helicopter
community policing. I mean,
things cost. It gets expensive.
We've heard about this concept and talked about this concept of community policing, officers being proactive to build relationships within the communities, build trust within communities, having officers get out of their cars, walk around, introduce themselves, and get to know people that live in these areas to try to bridge that divide a little bit. And yet, as much as we've heard talk about it, it seems for all intents and purposes a failure, that we haven't been able to really achieve those goals and really achieve exactly what police say they want to do. Why haven't we been able to do a better job with building relationships and communities between officers and community leaders?
I think it's because we've taken our eye off the ball. We have forgotten what was important. And what is important, you shouldn't police at people. That's the wrong approach. You cannot police at people. You have to police with people. And that means bringing them in, helping solve the problems that they see in their communities, and working with them that way. That's how you build the relationships. You have to be one with the community. And there are a ton of programs out there that have started and failed, and or they've stopped running them, whatever they happen to be, or whatever their circumstances were. There used to be programs that were geared toward those types of things. And it became too expensive. We didn't have enough police officers. There's a litany of excuses why they didn't move forward. But I will tell you, and most law enforcement folks they'll say the same thing, is that when you have a relationship with the community, you have fewer problems in those communities. And it is all about the relationship. It's all about the things that Dr. Shabazz was saying, that it's about giving people opportunities to better themselves, to allow them to move forward in our societies. And in a lot of cases, the police are there to stop that, or they get in the way of that sometimes with either taking too much of the budgets or the tactics and the strategies that are employed by some police departments when they go into certain communities. You can start to stifle all kinds of stuff that way. So there has to be a reckoning of sorts where police departments realize more than ever. Because if you look at those crowds, the crowds that are out there around the country have been more diverse than they have ever been before. So that should tell everybody something. People, as my grandmother used to say, she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And it's the same type of thing. I think we're hearing that from folks, and police departments have to understand that they have to go about policing differently.
Can I just offer a point, an example that I think really speaks to what Kevin is saying? I'm gonna go back to Chicago because I lived there, done lots of research, and someone on the comments page made a reference to Chicago's violence. Between 2000 and 2009, the city funded a small group of former gang members, people who were who were in the drug trade, many of who spent time in prison, and they worked with an epidemiologist at the University of Chicago to learn how to do violence intervention training. This epidemiologist, whose name I can't remember at the time, saw violence as similar to a disease like COVID, and that violence, as it sort of congeals and solidifies in a particular location, can spread out like any disease, the flu, COVID, so on and so forth. So he trained these people from the community in one of the most violent communities on the south side of Chicago, where I grew up, Inglewood, how to do de-escalation and mediation training. Right. So when there was tension in the neighborhood, these sort of first responders would go out, talk to the parties involved, de-escalate the tension, mediate the tension, and find a way to come to an agreement without bloodshed. The result was a significant reduction in violent crime in Inglewood, which is one of the most violent communities on the South Side still to this day. Rahm Emanuel cut the program. In part, he cut the program because of pressure from the police chief, who didn't want non-police officers doing what he considered to be police work. Right now, it's the limited thinking of both Rahm Emanuel and his former police chief that undermined the stability of that program. But the program provides us with an opportunity and an example of how we can deal with instability, with violence, and respond to community-based problems without policing and without all of the things that come along with policing. Communities of color right now, this moment really illustrates that policing has not worked, and it is not working. What does work are things like mediation, de-escalation, mental health, and other community-based first responders dealing with the everyday problems that happen in communities of color and communities across the nation. But policing does not work. Not only does it not work, it's been detrimental to the health of Black and Latinx communities from ocean to ocean, right? And the evidence is there. It is clear. It is documented 10 times over, right? So this call for transforming or for defunding the police opens up space for the types of programs that I'm talking about, right? Mediation, de-escalation training, public health, mental health, all of these things that Black and Latinx and poor communities, right? Poor white communities all across the nation need, right? Drug abuse, policing was disastrous to drug abuse and has been disastrous to drug abuse. The war on drugs locked up generations of Black and Latinx and poor people across the nation. It was a fundamental error, and it undermined the stability of communities for generations, right? Let's not make the same mistake again. Let's have both the courage and the ingenuity to recognize that this is not working, that policing is not working. And what we need is a fundamental restructuring of not only how we fund them, but what it is that they do. And the old moment of, the gun and the baton on the hip, fighting crime, has proved to be a myth at best and a failure. And we need something new. And communities of color are now asking for something better.
One of the things I wanted to get into is the fragmentation of policing. Phoenix Police does things one way, Mesa Police does things another way, and so on and so forth. And in Dr. Shabazz is talking about de-escalation. That's one of the things that the Democrats, the state Democrats, have put out as one of the things that they want to have implemented in a special session. So earlier we were talking about the slowness of legislation, and they're calling for a special session in conjunction with the COVID-19 stuff this summer. And de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, training requirements in order to be certified as a peace officer, a database that houses police discipline records so that officers can't jump from agency to agency. If you got fired in Yuma, you can't come to Phoenix and be hired, or if you got fired in Phoenix, you can't move somewhere else and be hired. Limited qualified immunity for officers, which I know is probably a very big deal for police unions specifically, and turning over investigations to third parties rather than investigating themselves. And then finally, every officer in the state having body-worn cameras. I'm curious and Dr. Shabazz, I'm going to start with you. I'm curious what your opinion is of those things that I just named that Democrats are proposing.
I think they are a good first step toward fundamental structural change to policing in this state and the nation. And, here's an opportunity for Arizona to be the first, to lead the nation, to provide a blueprint for what can be done elsewhere. All we need is courage, a little bit of political will, and some action. So I think those things set a foundation for doing the kind of systematic and structural change that we need to see both in this state and beyond.
Let's bring in Kevin and Rick. Some of these things seem very practical. They seem to be things that we could do. We could fund them. And if nothing else, it would achieve transparency, having body cams for every officer. Is there any reason we shouldn't have that at this point?
No, there isn't. It just isn't. It's easy to do. And most agencies are starting to step up. The unfortunate thing is they're doing it after a tragedy occurs. Then, then you're still trying to make up the time. The unfortunate thing is, people will fall back on, well, it's going to cost too much money. It's going to do this, that, and the other thing. Policing is expensive. You have to make some decisions. And maybe what Dr. Shabazz is saying is you make some decisions as to not funding certain areas and going in other areas and making sure you have these programs. I was reading the article that Courtney is responding to as well. And there are a lot of good ideas in the article itself. We have to realize a lot of that stuff is starting to happen. And it's starting to happen because people are speaking up. And I think the more they hear from folks, and I say they, I'm talking about city council, state representatives, mayors and city managers and police chiefs, I believe are starting to move in that direction. The more they hear from folks, the more apt we are to make those adjustments, adopt those things. It's just a matter of having the wherewithal, just the courage and the wherewithal to say, this is what we're going to do, and this is the direction we're going in.
And be willing to maybe take the police union's wrath when you do.
You have to. Police chiefs, they know they're going to deal with unions. That any police chief that thinks they're going to have a loving relationship with their union, they're misguided. That's just not going to happen, because you're going to make decisions that not everybody's going to be happy with. And the minute that happens, they're going to come at you. And it's unfortunate, but you at least have to establish a relationship. I think police chiefs, if it's a new chief coming in or it's a chief that's been there for a while, you sit down with the union and say, this is what we're going to do. And whether they agree with it or not, you explain why. It's for the betterment of the organization as a whole. It's for the betterment of the citizens in our community that we are sworn to protect. When you lay it all out, you lay it out for them, make sure people understand that those are why you're making these changes. Shame on them for not going along with it.
Rick, I want to ask you on the other end of it. We often talk about an issue that appears to be gaining at least a little bit of traction politically, and that's the issue of criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. Do you see traction on that? Do you see progress? Do you think that we can make significant changes on that front? Because it seems to be an issue where at least some Democrats and Republicans have been able to come together to move us forward.
I think that you can get some criminal justice reform. It's just how it is presented and what is the changes that they want to make will be. We've talked about this for a long period of time. As a professor has indicated, I want to be a little bit more, hopeful about the future, because to me, today is different than what I've felt in the last, 40 years of my criminal justice experience. There does seem to be a change going on and a momentum that I think can make meaningful changes itself. But we've got a little bit of my hopefulness is that, we do know how to do some of these things. When Kevin was with Phoenix Police and I was the county attorney, we worked hard on what was called the broken windows theories, to work with the community, to try to make neighborhoods, be very, to take pride in your neighborhood and to engage the community. And we saw great progress. We used to work with the youth in a variety of different capacities, and it did make a difference. Things did change after Columbine, after 9/11. Law enforcement had to shift. I'm going to stand up a little bit for law enforcement here, because I do believe that they are, by and large, good. What the problem is that we've got to shift back. And that is not always easy. It's a cultural change. You mentioned, should we have body cams on every police officer? Absolutely. That's a no-brainer nowadays. But you know what the problem is? Officers don't turn them on. How many times have you sat there and seen a situation, the officer didn't have on his body cam? In the Mesa situation that I did just last year, several officers didn't have on their body cams. And they've been disciplined before for it numerous times. So what I think really has to occur, you've got to empower, I think, the chiefs, because I think that the chiefs, by and large, want to do what is right for their community, for their agency, and they want to regain the trust, out in the community itself. And you've got to empower them, because unfortunately, I hate to say it this way, but politics does interject itself. City managers have control over the police chief. And so when they want to fire somebody, maybe we shouldn't be doing it that way. I got to tell you, the officers that were involved in Mesa, I thought the discipline should have been much worse. In fact, I thought one officer should be fired. But it didn't work that way, and it didn't just come from the chief. The whole system itself weighed in. And so the chief really didn't have the power to do some things. And it's somewhat political, because the unions do interject themselves. You know, they say, I'm not going to support this city council member, this mayor, you know, I'm not going to endorse them. And it's tough. It's real tough. That's why I say it's well to, you know, professor, to sit there and say, you know, we need to do it today, but unless you embody it into some type of law, I'm not sure how far you're going to be able to get. You know, I think that, yes, do what you can today, but some of the things that are so fundamental, you know, a centralized database for disciplinary action on police officers, make that in state law and make AZ Post have to keep that database. You know, another example, Kevin, do you remember when I created the centralized Brady list in the county attorney's office? The Brady list is basically where the prosecutor has a duty to disclose to the defense counsel any information they have on an officer that may challenge their veracity in court, you know, their truthfulness or anything like that. Well, before and around the country, it still exists. You know, individual attorneys would try to, you know, if they came to their attention, they would disclose it, but we never really had a centralized database. I finally told all the police agencies, we're going to centralize that. I'm asking that every time you discipline an officer that involves a Brady issue, I want it to come to my office so that we keep a centralized database. You can't believe how crazy it got. I mean, I see you smiling, Kim. I literally but we did it. And you know what? We were the leader in the country to do that. And now, you know what? Why should it only be in Maricopa County? Why don't we have a statewide database? You know, because
why shouldn't it be public record as well? Because at this point, it's not. I mean, it's not public record at this point as well. The county attorney's office keeps that list, but we've tried to get it.
I disagree with that. It depends on your county attorney, I guess. I do believe that those matters are technically public records. You know, it's a personnel matter, but that's going into the legal niceties. But the point is, you've got to rebuild the trust in the public. That's the fundamental thing, that law enforcement is going to keep its objectivity and do the right thing. They should not be investigating themselves. They should have a centralized database for Brady material, for disciplinary issues, and so forth. Yes, Courtney, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say you finished it up. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the issue with the slowness, right? We invited Black Lives Matter group to participate in this, and they declined, but sent a statement instead explaining why they declined it. I wanted to read that in full. It says, police officers and prosecutors have been purveyors of injustice for far too long. The carceral state has provided them with amplified voices, pristine narratives, and countless platforms to further their systemic racism. That may be changing, but it's only possible because the voices of the oppressed are being lifted. Some platforms, like yours, have decided to join in that effort by giving a space for us to talk about our abolition work and what it means to us. We need those efforts, but this specific opportunity is antithetical to that support. Prosecutors and police have abandoned their personal morality in contributing to such an ugly system in the profession that they have chosen. They have nothing to say about what is needed unless they quit their jobs or use their power to work towards the liberation of our people. The American police officers should no longer exist. The American prison system should crumble. Police officers and prosecutors are not ready to hear that message and participate in a dialogue about why that is the only way forward. Now, this is from, there are several Black Lives Matter groups in Arizona. This one is from Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. Let me get your response to that. I'm going to start with, I'll start with you, Rick. You seem like you have something to say.
Yeah, I understand. Well, as much as a white guy can understand, I think I'm beginning to understand even better than I used to the urgency for this particular issue. But to sit there and say that police officers should not exist and the prison system should crumble, that's just naivete. I mean, we deal with some very, very dangerous individuals. Unfortunately, law enforcement is needed in those particular situations. Can we do a better job? Can we prioritize better? Absolutely. But law enforcement has a major function for our society to to allow us to live safely and carefully, within our particular community. So I know that frustration is there, but you've got to think through how you're going to do it. To sit there and they've hurt their message by saying law enforcement should go away. I mean, that's just not even realistic. And I don't think 99% of Arizona citizens agree with that. I just don't, and they shouldn't, because I've seen too much death. Kevin has seen the death. We've been out to too many homicide scenes, too many domestic violence situations in which somebody is seriously injured. It's just wrong. And I just won't go along with that.
But Rick, law enforcement doesn't make it better. And that's the thing, right? As a retroactive organization who gets there after the fact, they don't make it better. Take this statistic just as a way of thinking about it. In 2015, the United States spent more than $500 million on incarceration, federal and state, more than 500 million.
I believe you mean billion.
I'm sorry, 500 billion. 500 billion.
We spend $1 billion in the state alone.
Yes. Billion isn't B. Yes, right. 500 billion on federal and state incarceration. I think Kevin and Rick know the awful statistics around recidivism, right? 60%. So 60% in grade school, in middle school, in high school, and college is a D. It is not, it is barely passing at minimum, 60%. So in other words, every 10 people who go in, 10 come out, 6 come back in. Why are we spending $500 billion on a system that is failing? Why are we doing that? There are several reasons why we are doing that, right? All of which I don't have time to get into here, but what it illustrates is failure. And that failure must be accounted for. And to say that, Black Lives Matter and other organizations are sort of pie in the sky. Well, the fact of the matter is that all of the statistics that state and federal government hold around criminal justice demonstrate that the system is failing, that the police officers are failing, that probation and parole is failing, that incarceration is failing, but we continue to dump billions and billions of dollars back into the system, devouring social wealth, and misusing our public funds, right? So this signifies that we need a different approach, and that might mean that we rethink incarceration, right? Particularly around things like drug crimes, right? We've seen the devastating effects of incarcerating people for drug crimes, right? And over the last few years, as the opioid crisis has ravaged America, particularly white Americans, now all of a sudden the country has a whole new way of thinking about it. Now there's this sort of, as some of my friends say, this come to Jesus moment, where now all of a sudden we're rethinking the necessity of incarcerating people over drug use, right? And even the president has even signaled that we might want to start to rethink this. So look, the system has demonstrated its inability to do what it set out to do. It has demonstrated over and over that it fails, and that failure requires not, as you said, tinkering around the edges, but fundamental structural transformation.
Structural transformation, though, is different than eliminating the system itself, which is what BLM seems to be calling for here. And I think anybody can make a
minute, Steve.
Go ahead.
Professor, I don't disagree with you that we need to perhaps prioritize a little differently, and that we need to put a little bit more emphasis upon some social issues, doing more stuff at the front end. But in the last 20 years, violent crime has decreased by 70% throughout this nation. 70%. That's significant. That is significant. And I forgive you because you come from Chicago, but these are not new concepts. And law enforcement has it within their capability. They just got to do a shifting here. When I was county attorney back in 1989, what was one of the very first programs I created? I created a drug diversion program in which, when the police officer would sit there and cite an individual or even arrest somebody that was just using drugs, and they hadn't been through the system, they weren't hardcore criminals or hardcore injectors, I offered them an opportunity. I would not even file charges if they would go through treatment program. And I set it up to where they could, if they were indigent, they got it for free. And so we did this 30 years ago. So what we need to do is come back to some of the ideas that law enforcement had. We have it's just things have shifted a little bit. And so I do believe that resources have helped our communities be safer. Can they be better spent? Absolutely. I don't disagree. Should our legislature start looking at our mental health system and a variety of other programs themselves so that the criminal justice system isn't the one that has to deal with it? I don't disagree in the slightest. But to sit there and say it's a failure, I mean, I took it as almost an inferring that it was a total failure. I just disagree. I just totally disagree with that. And I've just seen too much harm from that.
I respect your disagreement, but all of the evidence demonstrates that it has been a failure. And that is why there are people on the streets today. Because the system has been fundamentally violent to the lives of Black and other people of color. And that has thrust people out onto the street. And mass incarceration, an epic fail. The war on drugs, an epic fail. And it has been devouring our state and social wealth for decades. We cannot do better for our schools because we have our money tied up in the criminal justice system. We cannot provide the kind of environmental transformation that we need to see, particularly in Phoenix, planting trees, creating shade, updating our parks, creating better roads, in part because we have dumped our money into the criminal justice system, which is producing nothing for us. So this has been an epic fail. And to take it personally means that we have to understand that failure can be mobilized for something productive, right? That we can take this failure and say, okay, this has not worked. Let's not continue to do this, and let's try something better.
I think we can all agree we can do better. We're a little over our time now. I always we should note that Black Lives Matter turned us down. We should also note that our county attorney turned us down for this discussion, as well as the police chief, Jerry Williams, turned us down for this discussion, both of them citing scheduling conflicts. But all of you have cited a lack of leadership in this debate. And so I want to ask you an open-ended question. If you had a few minutes with the governor, or if you had a few minutes with this president, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them? Kevin, I'll start with you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question with both of them, either the governor or the president. I think what they need to do, both of them, maybe, I won't go there. They need to look and listen to what's happening in this country right now. Again, this is it's not a single group that's out there that's out there protesting, that's out there making sure they want to make sure things are changing. It's a huge diversity of our population that is out there across the board in cities and states that you wouldn't expect it. It's occurring there. So I think they need to listen. Everybody needs to listen. If I can add one thing, Dr. Shabazz made a lot of statements there. And as a Black man, I am not going to disagree with a lot of things that he is saying. As an educator, I'm getting into all of those things. And I will say that each semester I teach about 5 in-person classes at ASU, have close to 500 students over the semester. And these discussions are the very same discussions that we have in class. And there is one thing that gives me comfort and hope for the future is these young students, a lot of them wanting to go into different forms of criminal justice. They want to go to law school. They want to go into social work. They are all of the mindset that we can do better. And the things that you're talking about, the issues of recidivism, the issues of past police practices and tactics, they need to change. These kids are in tune to that. So I have hope for the future. Current leadership, I'm starting to see very positive things. Personally, I can't say enough good things about Jerry Williams. The county attorney, she looks like she is, quite honestly, doing some remarkable things. Reminds me a lot of what Rick Romley did when he was there. So I have faith that we're moving in the right direction. We're not there yet. We're better than we used to be, but we're nowhere near as great as we need to be.
Rick, what would you advise for the leaders of today?
I would, at the federal level, that would be a real challenge. But Governor Ducey, I think the Democrats have it right. I think that there needs to be a special session to deal with some of the issues today. With a special session, you can get something done in a very, very short period of time. It will not be comprehensive, but it will be making a change. And right now, the community needs to know that the leadership is going to do something. And I think that he should call a special session, bring in some experts, bring in the professor, bring in Kevin, to talk about, what might be able to be done. I mean, I personally support the idea of a centralized database for disciplinary issues. Law enforcement should not be investigating themselves. There are people out there that some things could be done. And I think that he would need to, that would be my recommendation to the governors. Call a special session, get the leaders in here that, and talk about it and get some legislation down by the end of the summer.
Professor Shabazz, I'll leave you with the last word.
I think good leadership is a skill set. It's not a natural trait. Nobody's born with good leadership genes. It's a skill set that's cultivated over time, and it requires some of the things that both Kevin and Rick spoke about: listening, being attentive to others, empathy, and having good ideas. Right? Those are really important elements of leadership. And at the federal level with Donald Trump, and at the state level with Doug Ducey, they have demonstrated a lack of all of those things. But there's one other characteristic of leadership that I think they both have and have the capacity of. Good leaders know when to get out of the way. And both right now, the president and the governor are in the way. And so while they probably will not remove themselves, stepping aside to allow for thoughtful, engaged conversation that produces useful ideas is something that we want our leaders to be able to do. So if the governor and the president aren't able to come up with productive solutions, if they don't have the capacity to be empathic toward people of color, particularly Black Americans, and if they can't listen, please move out of the way and allow space for those who have good ideas, who are empathic, who are attentive, and who can listen to take charge.
Dr. Rashad Shabazz, Kevin Robinson, Rick Romley, Courtney Holmes, I want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation, and let's keep the conversation going. I think we all know that we can make steps and take steps to progress this along the line toward a solution. I think we also know that it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of people listening and coming together and having these very difficult discussions about longstanding issues in our country. But I appreciate all of you taking the time to highlight some of those issues today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.